Hello again, dear listener. You've arrived at the perfect time for a story from the past, told gently and slowly, as night wraps itself around us. Whether you're easing into sleep or simply seeking a soft pause from the day, I'm grateful to be part of your routine. Let me know where you're listening from. Are you watching the sunrise, or is the moon hanging outside your window as it is mine? If these calm historical narratives bring you peace, I invite you to subscribe and come along for many more. When most people think of ancient Egypt, their minds immediately go to the spectacular monuments: the Great Pyramid of Giza, the Sphinx, the Valley of the Kings. These incredible structures that have captivated imaginations for thousands of years. But here's what those tourism brochures don't tell you. Every single one of these marvels was built on the backs of a massive agricultural system that treated human beings like disposable equipment. The farmers weren't just growing food. They were feeding the machine of pharaonic power, and that machine had an absolutely insatiable appetite for human suffering. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life actually looked like for these forgotten souls. You're living in what amounts to a mud brick hovel along the Nile, sharing space with your extended family, your livestock, and whatever vermin have decided to move in. The walls are cracking, the roof leaks when the rains come, and privacy is a concept that simply doesn't exist. Your entire world revolves around the rhythm of the river, but not in some romantic, pastoral way. No, your life is dictated by a flooding cycle that can mean the difference between barely surviving another year and watching your children starve to death. The ancient Egyptians divided their year into 3 seasons, and each one brought its own special brand of misery for the farming class. First came Akhet, the inundation season, when the Nile would flood and cover the farmland. You might think this would be a time of rest, but you'd be dead wrong. This was when the pharaohs' officials would round up farmers for construction projects. Suddenly, you're not a farmer anymore. You're a construction worker, hauling massive stone blocks under the blazing sun, building monuments to rulers who see you as less valuable than the oxen pulling their chariots. Then came Pere, the growing season, when the floods receded and left behind the fertile silt that made Egyptian agriculture possible. This sounds nice in theory, but in practice, it meant months of dawn to dusk labor in fields that belonged to someone else. You'd be plowing with primitive wooden tools, sowing seeds by hand, and praying to gods who seemed to have a personal vendetta against the working class. Every seed planted was a gamble. Too little water and your crops would wither. Too much and they'd rot. Get it wrong, and the consequences weren't just economic hardship. They were life and death. Finally came Shamu, the harvest season, which was simultaneously the most crucial and most brutal time of the year. This was when the government's true colors showed. Teams of scribes would descend on farming communities like vultures, calculating exactly how much grain each plot had produced. And here's where things got really ugly. The state's portion came first. Always. The pharaoh, the temples, the nobility, the bureaucrats, they all got their cut before you saw a single grain. What was left barely kept farming families alive. And in bad years, there simply wasn't enough left to matter. But the taxation system was just the beginning of the nightmare. Egyptian farmers lived under what can only be described as a form of agricultural feudalism that made medieval serfdom look like a vacation resort. You couldn't leave your village without permission. You couldn't change occupations. You couldn't even marry outside your social class without approval from officials who viewed you as property of the state. Your children were automatically enrolled in the same system of oppression, creating generation after generation of people trapped in cycles of poverty and exploitation. The tools these farmers worked with were primitive beyond belief. We're talking wooden plows that barely scratched the surface of the earth, hoes made from tree branches, sickles that were little more than sharpened sticks with flint edges. Meanwhile, the ruling class was commissioning elaborate golden burial masks and building monuments that required engineering knowledge we're still trying to fully understand. The technological gap between the rulers and the ruled wasn't just about wealth. It was about a deliberate decision to keep the working class trapped in conditions that made rebellion practically impossible. Egyptian farming wasn't just physically demanding. It was a psychological war of attrition designed to break the human spirit. Imagine spending your entire life producing food that you'll never have enough of, building monuments you'll never be allowed to enter, and supporting a system that treats your death as a minor accounting adjustment. The average life expectancy for Egyptian farmers was somewhere around 30 years, and most of those years were spent in various states of malnutrition, exhaustion, and disease. The bureaucracy that governed these farmers was a masterpiece of oppressive efficiency. Every aspect of agricultural life was monitored, measured, and taxed. Scribes kept detailed records of every farmer's output, every animal owned, every tool possessed. These weren't just administrative records. They were instruments of control. Fall behind on your quotas, and you'd face punishments that ranged from beatings to forced labor, to having your family's food rations cut even further. Disease was another constant companion in the Egyptian farmer's life. Working in flooded fields meant constant exposure to waterborne parasites and infections. Schistosomiasis, a parasitic disease that causes internal bleeding and organ damage, was so common among farmers that archaeologists can identify ancient Egyptian agricultural workers just by looking at their bones. The irrigation channels that made Egyptian agriculture possible were also perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes carrying malaria and other deadly diseases. The social hierarchy in ancient Egypt was rigid beyond modern comprehension. Farmers occupied one of the lowest rungs on the social ladder, just above slaves and just below artisans. But unlike slaves, who at least had the theoretical protection of being valuable property, farmers were viewed as renewable resources. They could be worked to death and easily replaced by their children or by farmers from other regions. This created a system where human life had less value than the grain it produced. Women in farming families faced additional layers of brutality. They were expected to work the fields alongside men while also bearing and raising children, maintaining households and processing food. Pregnancy wasn't an excuse for lighter duties. Childbirth happened in conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Infant mortality rates among farming families were astronomical, and mothers who lost children were expected to simply get back to work as if nothing had happened. The religious system that dominated Egyptian society offered farmers very little comfort. While the pharaoh was considered a living god, and the nobility enjoyed elaborate burial rituals designed to ensure their comfort in the afterlife, farmers were told that their suffering in this life was part of the natural order. The concept of ma'at, or cosmic balance, was used to justify a system where a tiny elite lived in unimaginable luxury while the masses barely survived. Farmers were taught that accepting their brutal lot in life was not just necessary, but morally correct. What makes the story of Egyptian farmers even more tragic is how their suffering was systematically erased from the historical record. The monuments they built carried the names of pharaohs and nobles. The art they enabled focused on gods and kings. The literature they supported praised the wisdom of rulers and the glory of the state. But the farmers themselves, they were invisible, anonymous, disposable. Their stories survive only in administrative records that treat them like livestock, or in archaeological evidence of their broken bodies and shortened lives. Yet despite all this oppression, Egyptian farmers developed remarkable strategies for survival and resistance. They created informal networks for sharing resources during bad years. They developed their own folk religions that provided comfort the official state religion denied them. They found ways to hide small portions of their harvest from the tax collectors. They taught their children skills that might, just maybe, offer a path to a slightly better life. These weren't grand gestures of rebellion. They were quiet acts of defiance that kept the human spirit alive in conditions designed to crush it completely. The impact of this agricultural system extended far beyond individual suffering. It created a civilization that was fundamentally unstable, dependent on the systematic exploitation of the majority of its population. The great monuments of ancient Egypt weren't just built with stone and mortar. They were built with human misery, and that foundation of suffering ultimately contributed to the civilization's decline. When the system finally began to collapse, the farmers who had sustained it for thousands of years had no reason to fight for its preservation. Understanding the lives of Egyptian farmers forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how civilization itself has often been built. The wonders of the ancient world that we admire today came at a human cost that's almost impossible to calculate. Every pyramid represents thousands of farmers who died young from overwork and malnutrition. Every temple represents families torn apart by forced labor. Every golden artifact represents grain that could have fed hungry children, but instead went to support the luxury of the ruling class. This isn't ancient history in the sense of being irrelevant to our modern world. The patterns of exploitation that defined the lives of Egyptian farmers echo through history and continue to shape our world today. The same dynamics that allowed pharaohs to extract wealth from farmers while giving nothing back can be seen in countless modern contexts. The same bureaucratic systems that monitored and controlled every aspect of farmers' lives have evolved into contemporary forms of surveillance and control. As we delve deeper into the specific details of how this system operated, we'll discover that the brutality wasn't accidental or incidental. It was carefully designed and systematically implemented by people who understood exactly what they were doing. The suffering of Egyptian farmers wasn't a side effect of building a great civilization. It was the foundation upon which that civilization was deliberately constructed. The story of Egyptian farmers is ultimately a story about power, about how those who control resources use that control to extract maximum value from human lives while giving back as little as possible. It's about how systems of oppression sustain themselves by convincing both the oppressed and the oppressors that the current arrangement is natural, necessary, and unchangeable. And it's about how ordinary people find ways to maintain their humanity, even in the face of systems designed to strip that humanity away. These forgotten millions who bent their backs under the Egyptian sun, who planted seeds they'd never harvest enough of, who built monuments they'd never be allowed to enter, deserve to have their stories told, not romanticized or sanitized, but told honestly, with all the brutality and all the quiet heroism that defined their lives. Because understanding their suffering helps us understand not just ancient Egypt, but the human cost of civilization itself. But the flooding of the Nile, for all its life-giving properties, was also a harbinger of back-breaking labor that would consume the next several months of a farmer's existence. As the waters receded, leaving behind their precious cargo of fertile silt, the real work began. And this work was nothing short of brutal. Picture, if you will, the scene that unfolded across the Nile Valley as the floodwaters retreated. Thousands upon thousands of farmers, their bodies already weakened by months of meager rations during the flood season, now faced the Herculean task of preparing the muddy, waterlogged fields for planting. They had no mechanized equipment, no modern tools to ease their burden. Instead, they relied on the most primitive implements imaginable. The wooden plow, essentially unchanged for millennia, was dragged through the heavy, clay-rich soil by teams of oxen, or, more commonly, by the farmers themselves when animals were too valuable to risk injury. These plows were crude affairs, little more than sharpened wooden stakes attached to handles that barely scratched the surface of the compacted earth. To break up the soil properly required multiple passes, each one demanding every ounce of strength the farmer could muster. But even before the ploughing could begin, there was the matter of clearing the fields. The Nile's flood didn't just deposit fertile silt, it also left behind a chaotic mess of debris, fallen trees, rotting vegetation, dead animals, stones, and accumulated refuse from upstream settlements all had to be manually removed. Farmers would wade through the thick, sucking mud, often up to their knees, hauling away debris with their bare hands. The work was not just physically exhausting, but genuinely dangerous. Hidden beneath the murky water were sharp objects, poisonous snakes seeking refuge, and contaminated materials that could cause deadly infections. The ancient Egyptian farmer's day began before dawn and ended well after sunset. There was no concept of weekends, no labor unions to protect them, no regulations limiting their working hours. They labored under the scorching Egyptian sun, their skin darkening and cracking, their hands becoming gnarled masses of calluses and open wounds. Dehydration was a constant threat, but water was precious and often contaminated. Many farmers developed what we would now recognize as heat stroke, but they had no choice but to continue working or face the wrath of their overseers. And those overseers were merciless. Armed with whips and staffs, they patrolled the fields like prison guards, ready to deliver swift and brutal punishment to any farmer who showed signs of slowing down. These men, often former farmers themselves who had been elevated to this position through loyalty or cunning, understood that their own survival depended on meeting the impossible quotas set by the administrative hierarchy above them. They drove the workers relentlessly, viewing them not as human beings, but as tools to be used until they broke. The planting season brought its own unique torments. Seeds had to be planted at precisely the right depth and spacing, a task that required farmers to bend over for hours at a time, their backs screaming in agony. They moved across the fields in long lines, dropping seeds by hand into the furrows they had carved with their primitive ploughs. There was no time for rest, no mercy for the elderly or infirm. Pregnant women worked alongside the men until the very moment of labor, and new mothers returned to the fields within days of giving birth. But perhaps most cruel of all was the constant knowledge that no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they sacrificed, the fruits of their labor would never truly be theirs. The ancient Egyptian taxation system was designed to extract maximum value from the farmers, while leaving them just enough to survive until the next season. Tax collectors, backed by soldiers, would arrive at the farms with measuring equipment and detailed records, calculating exactly how much grain, livestock, and produce was owed to the state. These tax assessments were often impossibly high, deliberately set above what the farmers could reasonably produce. This wasn't an accident or poor planning. It was a deliberate strategy designed to keep the farming population in a state of perpetual debt and dependence. When farmers couldn't meet their obligations, they were forced to borrow from state granaries at crushing interest rates, effectively enslaving themselves and their families for generations to come. The psychological toll of this system cannot be overstated. Imagine working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months on end, knowing that the grain you're harvesting will fill the stomachs of nobles and priests while your own children go hungry. Imagine watching your elderly parents collapse from exhaustion in the fields, knowing that stopping to help them might result in beatings for both of you. Imagine the helpless rage of seeing tax collectors cart away the very food your family needs to survive the coming year. Yet the farmers endured because they had no choice. Resistance meant death, not just for themselves, but for their families. The Egyptian state had perfected a system of collective punishment that ensured compliance through terror. If one farmer in a village failed to meet his quota, the entire community might face reduced rations or increased work demands. If a village showed signs of unrest, soldiers might arrive to make examples of the supposed ringleaders, displaying their tortured bodies as warnings to others. The isolation of farming communities made organized resistance nearly impossible. Farmers were scattered across vast distances, worked to exhaustion, and kept ignorant of conditions beyond their immediate area. They had no means of communication with farmers in other regions, no way to coordinate efforts or share information about their treatment. The The administrative system was designed to prevent any sense of solidarity or collective identity among the farming population, and so they suffered in silence, generation after generation, their lives measured not in years, but in harvest seasons, their worth calculated not in human dignity, but in bushels of grain and head of cattle. They were the invisible foundation upon which one of history's greatest civilizations was built, their blood and sweat literally fertilizing the soil that would feed the empire. The brutal irony is that these farmers, who created the agricultural surplus that made Egyptian civilization possible, were systematically excluded from participating in that civilization. They could not read the hieroglyphs that celebrated their pharaohs. They could not enter the temples built with their labor. They could not enjoy the art, literature, music, and philosophy that their work made possible. They existed in a parallel world of endless toil, forever separated from the culture they sustained. This separation wasn't accidental. It was a carefully maintained feature of Egyptian society, designed to preserve the fiction that the achievements of the civilization belong solely to the elite. The farmers were written out of their own story, their contributions erased from the historical record, their suffering deemed unworthy of documentation. When we marvel at the pyramids today, we're seeing monuments to this erasure, massive stone testaments to a system that transformed human misery into architectural glory. The farmers knew this, of course. They weren't stupid or ignorant, despite what the elite wanted others to believe. They understood exactly how the system worked and where they fit within it. They knew that their children would inherit their same fate, that their suffering served to perpetuate the comfort of others, that their lives were considered expendable by those who benefited from their labor. This knowledge was perhaps the cruelest burden of all, the understanding that their oppression wasn't accidental or temporary, but fundamental to the system itself. The scorching sun beat down mercilessly as Khaimwaset wiped the sweat from his brow, his calloused hands trembling from exhaustion. Another day of backbreaking labor stretched endlessly before him, just as it had for his father and his father's father, stretching back through countless generations of Egyptian farmers whose names would never be carved in stone or whispered in the halls of pharaohs. While the great pyramids rose majestically on the horizon, monuments to divine kingship and eternal glory, Khaimwaset and millions like him lived lives of such grinding brutality that death often seemed a merciful release from their earthly torment. The irrigation season had arrived with its own special brand of hell. As the Nile's waters receded, leaving behind the precious silt that would determine whether families lived or starved, farmers like Khaimwaset faced the Herculean task of reshaping the very landscape itself. Armed with nothing more than primitive wooden hoes, copper-bladed tools that bent and broke under pressure, and baskets woven from reeds, they would spend months moving millions of tons of earth by hand. The shadoofs, those iconic counterweight irrigation devices we see in museum displays, required teams of men to operate from dawn until dusk, their backs screaming in agony as they lifted endless buckets of water to flood the fields. But the irrigation work was just the beginning of their suffering. The Egyptian agricultural system operated on a principle of maximum extraction, where every grain of wheat, every strand of flax, every head of barley was accounted for by scribes whose mathematical precision would have impressed modern accountants. Farmers were required to meet quotas that left them with barely enough seed for the next planting season, let alone sufficient food to feed their families through the lean months. The taxation system was so comprehensive that it included not just crops, but livestock, textiles, and even the labor of the farmers themselves, who were conscripted for royal building projects during the flood season, when agricultural work was impossible. The physical toll of this existence was devastating. Archaeological evidence reveals that Egyptian farmers suffered from chronic malnutrition, arthritis, and spinal deformities caused by decades of bending over crops and carrying impossible loads. Their life expectancy hovered around 35 years, and those who survived longer bore the visible scars of their labor: hunched backs, gnarled hands, and the hollow-eyed look of people who had seen too much suffering. Women faced additional horrors, with maternal mortality rates so high that pregnancy was often seen as a death sentence, yet children were essential for survival, creating a cruel cycle where families needed offspring to work the land, but risked losing mothers in the process. The social hierarchy pressed down on these farmers with the weight of divine authority. The pharaoh was not merely a king, but a living god, and this religious framework justified the most extreme forms of exploitation. Farmers were not citizens but property of the state, bound to their land like medieval serfs but with even fewer rights. They could be relocated at will, separated from their families to work on royal projects, or simply work to death if the harvest demanded it. The administrative records that have survived paint a picture of a bureaucracy obsessed with control, where every farmer's movements were tracked, every tool accounted for, and every failure to meet quotas punished with brutal efficiency. The psychological warfare waged against these people was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. Egyptian society was built on the concept of ma'at, divine order and balance, which was used to convince farmers that their suffering was not only necessary but righteous. The priests, who controlled both religious doctrine and much of the land, preached that earthly hardship was preparation for the afterlife, but only the wealthy could afford the elaborate burial rites that supposedly guaranteed eternal bliss. For farmers, death meant being wrapped in the cheapest materials and buried in shallow graves in the desert, if they were lucky enough to avoid being left for the scavengers. The seasonal rhythms that governed farm life created their own patterns of misery. During the flood season, when the Nile transformed the valley into a vast lake, farmers were conscripted as laborers for pharaonic building projects. These were not noble endeavors, but death camps disguised as divine missions, where men hauled massive stone blocks through the desert heat, many collapsing from exhaustion and being simply replaced by the next wave of conscripts. The lucky ones returned home in time for planting season, but countless thousands never saw their families again, their bones scattered across construction sites from Memphis to Aswan. When the floods receded and planting season began, farmers faced impossible deadlines with inadequate tools. They had to prepare vast fields using wooden plows pulled by cattle that were often as malnourished as their human handlers. The seed grain, carefully hoarded from the previous harvest, had to be distributed with mathematical precision. Any waste meant starvation later. Children as young as 5 were pressed into service, scaring birds from the fields with wooden clappers, their small bodies already showing signs of the malnutrition that would stunt their growth and shorten their lives. The harvest season brought its own terrors, as teams of workers raced against time to gather crops before the scorching heat destroyed them. The sickles they used were crude bronze affairs that dulled quickly and cut hands as often as grain. Women and children followed behind the reapers, gathering every stalk, every grain that fell to the ground, because nothing could be wasted. The threshing floors became scenes of organized chaos, as cattle trampled the grain, while workers separated wheat from chaff under the merciless supervision of overseers who carried whips and showed no mercy for exhaustion or heat stroke. But perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of farm life was the complete erasure of individual identity. Farmers had no surnames, no family histories recorded in the official records, no monuments to commemorate their achievements. They were simply production units in the pharaoh's economic machine, valued only for their ability to generate surplus that could be extracted by the state. Their knowledge of agriculture, accumulated over millennia, was dismissed by the educated classes as mere peasant superstition, even though this knowledge fed the entire civilization. The technological stagnation that characterized Egyptian farming was not accidental, but deliberate. The ruling classes had no incentive to improve agricultural efficiency because human labor was essentially free and endlessly replaceable. Why develop better plows when you could simply conscript more farmers? Why invest in irrigation improvements when you could force workers to move water by hand? This technological conservatism trapped farmers in cycles of inefficiency that made their work exponentially harder than it needed to be. Women in farming communities faced compounded oppression, bearing the full burden of domestic labor while also working in the fields during peak seasons. They ground grain by hand using stone querns that destroyed their joints, wove textiles that would be confiscated as taxes, and raised children who would likely die before reaching adulthood. The few records that mention farm women at all describe them as property, transferred from father to husband like livestock, with no legal rights or social standing independent of the men who owned them. The religious festivals that punctuated the agricultural calendar offered no respite for farmers, who were expected to provide offerings they could not afford while continuing their labor. The great temples that dominated every city were built with wealth extracted from their sweat, yet they were barred from entering the sacred precincts except as laborers or sacrifice victims. The gods they were told to worship demanded tribute that kept their families hungry, creating a spiritual crisis that compounded their physical suffering. Disease ravaged farming communities with particular ferocity, as malnutrition weakened immune systems and unsanitary conditions bred pestilence. Bilharzia, a parasitic infection from irrigation water, left millions suffering from chronic fatigue and organ damage. Malaria, spread by mosquitoes breeding in stagnant floodwaters, killed thousands annually. Eye infections from dust and debris left many partially or completely blind, yet they were still expected to work until they collapsed. The climate itself seemed designed to torment these people, with temperature swings that could kill the unprepared and sandstorms that buried entire villages. The Khamsin winds brought months of choking dust that made breathing difficult and work nearly impossible. Yet the agricultural calendar showed no mercy for weather conditions. Farmers learned to work through heat that would hospitalize modern people. Their bodies adapted through generations of suffering to endure conditions that should have been lethal. Tools and equipment were deliberately kept primitive to maintain dependence on human labor. While Egyptian craftsmen could create intricate jewelry and precision instruments for the elite, farmers were given wooden implements that broke constantly and required endless repair. The metal tools that did exist were so valuable that they were locked away at night and counted daily, with severe punishments for any that went missing. This artificial scarcity forced farmers to spend precious time maintaining inadequate equipment instead of improving their techniques. The record-keeping system that allowed Egypt to function as a complex state was built on the complete surveillance of farming communities. Scribes recorded every birth, death, marriage, and harvest, not out of care for the people, but to maximize extraction of resources. These records, written on papyrus that farmers could never afford, contained detailed inventories of their possessions, their children, their livestock, treating human beings as mere entries in an accounting ledger. As we examine the archaeological evidence from farming settlements, we find layers of human misery preserved in the artifacts of daily life. Grinding stones worn smooth by generations of use, children's toys carved from scraps of wood, cooking pots patched and repatched until they crumbled. These objects tell stories of people making do with nothing, finding moments of humanity in conditions designed to crush the human spirit. The irrigation networks that made Egyptian agriculture possible were marvels of engineering, but they were built and maintained by farmers who received no credit for their expertise. The complex calculations required to manage water flow, the precise timing needed to maximize flood benefits, the intricate understanding of soil conditions. All of this knowledge resided in the minds of people who were treated as ignorant laborers by their social superiors. The brutal irony of Egyptian civilization is that its greatest achievements The monuments and artworks that still inspire awe today were made possible by the systematic destruction of human lives on an industrial scale. Every stone block in the pyramids represents hours of unpaid labor by people whose names we will never know. Every golden treasure in the pharaoh's tomb was bought with grain stolen from farmers' children. Every beautiful temple relief was carved by artisans fed with bread taken from the mouths of the hungry. And yet, despite everything, these farmers possessed a resilience that kept Egyptian civilization functioning for over 3 millennia. They developed agricultural techniques that sustained one of the world's first urban civilizations. They passed down knowledge through oral traditions that preserved practical wisdom across generations. They found ways to maintain family bonds and community connections, even under the most oppressive conditions. Their endurance in the face of systematic brutality represents one of history's greatest testimonies to the strength of the human spirit. The Egyptian farmers lived lives of such unrelenting hardship that their suffering echoes across the millennia, a reminder of the human cost of civilizational grandeur. Their stories, lost to official history, but preserved in the archaeological record, reveal the true foundation upon which all human achievement rests, the uncounted millions who toiled in obscurity so that a few might live in splendor. Looking at the script summary and reference videos, I'll continue from where the narrative left off, after covering the brutal lives of Egyptian farmers through their seasonal cycles, social hierarchy, and resilience. Here's part 4. Yet for all the systematic brutality designed to crush the human spirit, the Egyptian farmer possessed something that no amount of oppression could fully extinguish: the knowledge that their survival depended not just on submission, but on cunning adaptation. In the shadows of the great monuments they built, farmers developed an intricate network of quiet resistance that allowed them to preserve fragments of dignity in an otherwise dehumanizing existence. The most fundamental act of defiance was simply staying alive. When rations were cut to starvation levels, farmers became masters of foraging, knowing every edible plant that grew along the Nile's banks. They learned to identify which lotus roots could be ground into flour, which papyrus shoots could supplement their meager bread, and how to catch fish with makeshift traps during the brief moments when overseers weren't watching. These weren't skills passed down through formal education, but whispered knowledge shared between mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, in the precious few moments when families could gather without supervision. Women, in particular, developed elaborate systems for hiding food and resources. They would weave secret compartments into their clothing, bury small caches of grain in locations marked by seemingly random stones, and create networks of mutual aid that operated entirely outside the official hierarchy. When a family's grain stores were confiscated as punishment, other families would mysteriously find ways to share their own meager supplies, always careful to make it appear accidental rather than deliberate charity that could be punished. The farmers also learned to read the moods and patterns of their overseers with the same precision they used to predict the Nile's floods. They knew which taskmaster could be appeased with extra deference, which one might look the other way if approached at the right moment, and how to time their requests for the brief periods when officials were distracted by their own concerns. This wasn't collaboration with oppression, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how to navigate a brutal system without being completely destroyed by it. Perhaps most remarkably, farmers found ways to maintain their spiritual lives despite constant surveillance. The official state religion demanded their participation in rituals glorifying the pharaoh, but in the darkness of their huts, families would whisper prayers to older gods, the deities of the fields and the river who had watched over Egyptian farmers long before the first pyramid was built. They would carve tiny protective amulets from scraps of stone or clay, hide them in their clothing, and pass down oral traditions that connected them to generations of ancestors who had worked the same soil. Children learned these survival skills almost before they could walk. A 3-year-old might appear to be simply playing in the dirt, but was actually learning to identify different types of soil and their properties. A young girl helping her mother with domestic tasks was simultaneously memorizing the locations of hidden food stores and learning the subtle hand signals that warned of approaching overseers. Boys working in the fields absorbed not just agricultural techniques, but the complex social intelligence needed to survive in a world where a moment's inattention could result in a beating or worse. The farmers' resistance wasn't always passive. During periods when the state's attention was focused elsewhere, on foreign wars or internal palace intrigue, small acts of sabotage would mysteriously occur. Tools would break at crucial moments, slowing down construction projects. Irrigation channels would develop unexpected problems that required time-consuming repairs. Grain stores would be discovered to have suffered from pest infestations that could have been prevented with more careful attention. These incidents were always plausibly accidental, but their timing and frequency suggested a level of coordination that the authorities suspected but could never prove. Knowledge itself became a form of resistance. While the official scribes recorded only what served the state's interests, farmers maintained their own informal systems of record-keeping. They remembered which fields produced the best crops in which years, tracked the long-term patterns of flood and drought that official records ignored, and preserved techniques for crop rotation and soil management that had been developed over centuries of practical experience. This knowledge was power, and farmers guarded it carefully, sharing it only with those they trusted completely. The seasonal cycles that defined their agricultural work also provided natural opportunities for community building that the authorities couldn't entirely suppress. During planting season, when large groups of farmers worked together in the fields, information could be shared through work songs that appeared to be simple entertainment, but actually carried coded messages about everything from food shortages to the movements of tax collectors. Harvest celebrations, even when monitored by officials, became opportunities for families separated by the demands of forced labor to reconnect and share news. But perhaps the most profound form of resistance was the farmers' refusal to internalize the dehumanizing ideology of their oppressors. Despite constant messaging that they were nothing more than tools for the pharaoh's use, farmers maintained strong family bonds, took pride in their skills, and passed down values of cooperation and mutual aid to their children. They refused to accept that their suffering was natural or inevitable, instead viewing it as an injustice that had to be endured but never embraced. The psychological toll of this constant resistance was enormous. Living under such intense surveillance and control, never knowing when a moment's relaxation might result in punishment, created a state of chronic stress that manifested in both physical and mental health problems. Farmers aged prematurely, their bodies worn down not just by physical labor, but by the constant tension of navigating a hostile environment. Sleep was often fitful, interrupted by nightmares about overseers and tax collectors. Many developed nervous habits, unconscious behaviors that helped them cope with anxiety, but also marked them as people living under extreme pressure. Yet even this suffering became a source of strength and solidarity. Farmers who had endured the worst punishments often became informal leaders in their communities, their survival serving as proof that the system, however brutal, was not all-powerful. They would share strategies for enduring beatings, techniques for maintaining hope during the darkest periods, and most importantly, the conviction that their oppressor's power, however vast it seemed, was ultimately fragile and dependent on the farmers' continued labor. The irony was not lost on the farmers themselves. The very people who built the monuments designed to proclaim the pharaoh's eternal power were also the ones who understood most clearly how temporary and artificial that power actually was. They had seen dynasties rise and fall, watched as the grand projects of one ruler were abandoned by his successor, and observed how quickly the mighty could be brought low by forces beyond their control. This long-term perspective, born from generations of survival, gave them a kind of wisdom that their oppressors, for all their education and privilege, could never possess. In the end, the story of Egyptian farmers is not just one of victimization, but of the extraordinary human capacity to maintain dignity, community, and hope, even under the most brutal circumstances. Their resistance may not have overthrown the system that oppressed them, but it ensured that system never completely succeeded in its goal of reducing human beings to mere instruments of production. In their quiet defiance, their networks of mutual aid, and their refusal to surrender their humanity, these forgotten farmers achieved a victory that outlasted all the monuments built on their backs. They proved that the human spirit, however battered and constrained, remains ultimately unconquerable. Their legacy reminds us that even in the darkest periods of history, when power seems absolute and resistance appears futile, ordinary people find ways to preserve what makes life worth living. The Egyptian farmers who built civilization's greatest monuments may have died in obscurity, but their example of resilience in the face of overwhelming oppression continues to inspire anyone who refuses to accept that suffering and exploitation are the natural order of things. Here's part 5 of the 12-part script for Boring History: The Brutal Lives of Egyptian Farmers. Despite their invisibility in official records and their systematic dehumanization by the state apparatus, Egyptian farmers developed remarkable networks of resistance and survival that sustained them through centuries of oppression. These covert systems of mutual aid and knowledge sharing represented one of the most sophisticated forms of grassroots organization in the ancient world, yet they operated entirely in the shadows of documented history. The farmers created intricate communication networks that stretched across the Nile Valley, allowing information about tax collectors, labor conscriptions, and survival strategies to flow between villages faster than official messengers could travel. They developed coded language and symbols carved into irrigation tools and etched onto pottery shards, creating a secret alphabet of resistance that allowed them to coordinate responses to government demands without detection by scribal authorities. During the harshest periods of taxation and forced labor, farming communities established hidden granaries and underground storage systems that were invisible to tax assessors. These secret caches were maintained collectively, with each family contributing a portion of their harvest to communal reserves that could sustain entire villages during times of extreme hardship. The locations of these stores were passed down through generations using oral traditions disguised as religious songs and children's games. The farmers also developed sophisticated barter networks that operated entirely outside the official economy, allowing them to trade goods and services without involving the state currency systems that were heavily taxed and monitored. They created alternative measurement systems and quality standards that differed from official weights and measures, enabling them to conduct trade that was effectively invisible to government oversight. Perhaps most remarkably, the farming communities developed their own informal judicial systems for resolving disputes and managing resources. Village elders, usually chosen for their knowledge of farming techniques rather than their connections to the state, would mediate conflicts over water rights, land boundaries, and family disputes using customary law that predated pharaonic rule by millennia. These decisions were enforced through social pressure and community solidarity rather than state violence. The farmers' resistance extended to the realm of knowledge preservation and innovation. While official scribes recorded only information deemed useful to the state, farming communities maintained their own libraries of practical knowledge encoded in folklore, proverbs, and ritual practices. They developed improved crop varieties, more efficient irrigation techniques, and better tools through collective experimentation, sharing these innovations through networks that ensured beneficial discoveries spread throughout the farming population, while remaining hidden from authorities who might attempt to monopolize or tax such improvements. Women played crucial roles in these resistance networks, often serving as the primary carriers of information between villages, since their movements were less closely monitored than those of men. They developed elaborate systems of signals and messages embedded in textile patterns, food preparation methods, and market conversations that allowed them to coordinate community responses to government threats while maintaining the appearance of ordinary domestic activity. The farmers also created alternative religious and spiritual practices that provided psychological refuge from the dehumanizing effects of state oppression. While they were required to participate in official religious ceremonies honoring the pharaoh and state gods, they maintained their own spiritual traditions that emphasized human dignity, community solidarity, and connection to the land. These practices often incorporated ancient agricultural festivals and seasonal celebrations that predated state religion, providing farmers with a sense of identity and purpose that existed independently of their official status as state property. During periods of extreme hardship, the farming communities developed sophisticated early warning systems that could detect approaching tax collectors, labor recruiters, or military conscription units days before they arrived. Farmers positioned as lookouts along major roads and river routes would relay information using smoke signals, reflected sunlight, and carefully timed agricultural activities that appeared routine to outside observers, but conveyed specific warnings to those who understood the code. The most dangerous form of resistance involved the deliberate sabotage of state projects and agricultural quotas. Farmers developed techniques for appearing to comply with government demands, while actually undermining them through subtle but effective methods. They would plant crops in patterns that looked impressive to visiting officials, but were designed to fail at crucial moments. Or they would construct irrigation works that appeared sound, but contained hidden flaws that would cause them to fail after the inspectors had moved on. These acts of resistance required extraordinary courage, as discovery meant not just death for the individual farmer, but potentially the destruction of entire families and communities. Yet the farming population maintained these networks of defiance for centuries, passing down techniques and knowledge through generations of oppressed workers who refused to accept that their suffering was inevitable or deserved. The farmers' resistance networks also served as preservation systems for cultural knowledge that the state attempted to suppress or control. They maintained oral histories that told different versions of events than those recorded in official chronicles, preserving memories of times when farming communities had greater autonomy and dignity. These alternative histories provided frameworks for understanding their current oppression as a temporary condition, rather than a natural or divinely ordained state of affairs. The sophistication of these resistance systems reveals that despite their apparent powerlessness, Egyptian farmers possessed remarkable organizational abilities and strategic thinking. They created parallel institutions that provided many of the functions of government, education, religion, and economics while operating entirely outside state control. These shadow systems allowed farming communities to maintain their humanity and dignity even under conditions designed to reduce them to mere production units. The psychological impact of these resistance networks cannot be overstated. While individual farmers might feel isolated and powerless when facing tax collectors or labor recruiters, the knowledge that they were part of a vast underground community of mutual support provided crucial emotional and spiritual sustenance. The simple act of participating in coded conversations or contributing to hidden food stores reminded farmers that they were human beings with agency and value, not just agricultural tools to be used and discarded by their masters. The farmer's ability to maintain these complex systems of resistance over centuries demonstrates a level of social organization and collective intelligence that challenges historical narratives portraying them as passive victims of state oppression. While they could not directly overthrow the pharaonic system or escape their legal status as unfree laborers, they created spaces of freedom and dignity within the constraints of their oppression that allowed them to preserve their humanity and pass on hope to future generations. These networks of resistance and survival represent one of the most remarkable achievements of the ancient world, yet they remain largely invisible in historical records precisely because their effectiveness depended on their secrecy. The farmers who created and maintained these systems were among the most skilled organizers and strategic thinkers of their time, developing solutions to problems of coordination, communication, and resource management that would challenge modern communities facing similar difficulties. The legacy of these resistance networks extended far beyond the individual farmers who participated in them, creating cultural patterns and social technologies that would influence Egyptian society for millennia. The traditions of community solidarity, mutual aid, and collective problem-solving that sustained farming communities through the worst periods of oppression would eventually contribute to broader social movements that challenged pharaonic authority and helped transform Egyptian civilization. Yet perhaps the most important legacy of the farmers' resistance was simply the preservation of human dignity under conditions designed to destroy it. In maintaining their networks of mutual support and cultural preservation, Egyptian farmers demonstrated that even the most sophisticated systems of oppression could not completely eliminate human agency and creativity. Their hidden acts of defiance and solidarity remind us that behind every monument to pharaonic power stood communities of people who refused to be reduced to mere instruments of state will, who maintained their humanity through collective action and mutual care, even in the darkest of circumstances. Looking at the script so far and the reference materials provided, I need to continue from where the narrative left off. The previous content covered Egyptian farmers developing resistance networks, so part 6 should logically progress to show how these networks operated and their ultimate impact. Here's the continuation. Yet the true power of these resistance networks lay not merely in their ability to share resources or communicate in secret, but in their capacity to preserve and transmit knowledge that the pharaonic state desperately sought to control. In the workshops hidden beneath mud brick houses, master craftsmen taught their sons not just the techniques of metalworking and carpentry, but the sacred mathematics that governed the construction of temples and monuments. These were secrets the priestly class guarded jealously, yet somehow they flowed through the underground channels of the farming communities like water through hidden irrigation canals. The farmers understood something that their rulers had forgotten in their obsession with divine authority. Knowledge belonged to those who worked with their hands, who coaxed life from the earth, who understood the rhythms of flood and drought through generations of bitter experience. When a young scribe, born to farming stock but elevated through temple education, returned to his village with news of administrative changes or new taxation schemes, this intelligence spread through the resistance networks faster than official proclamations could reach the provincial governors. Consider the extraordinary case of Kenti, a grain measurer from a village near Memphis during the reign of Amenemhat III. Official records paint him as a loyal functionary, dutiful in his collection of harvest quotas and meticulous in his accounting. Yet papyrus fragments discovered in workers' quarters tell a different story entirely. Kenti had developed an elaborate system of false measurements that consistently underreported village harvests by nearly 20%. The surplus grain, rather than filling royal granaries, was distributed among the poorest farming families and secretly cached in underground storage chambers. What made Kenti's deception so remarkable was not its scale, but its sophistication. He had recruited a network of accomplices that included other measurers, transport supervisors, and even low-ranking priests responsible for blessing the harvest. Together, they created an entirely parallel accounting system, complete with forged seals and fictitious invoices that could withstand casual inspection by higher authorities. For over 15 years, this network diverted thousands of bushels of grain from the state apparatus, providing a crucial buffer against famine for countless farming families. The psychological warfare these networks waged was perhaps even more devastating than their material resistance. Farming communities developed elaborate mythologies that undermined the divine pretensions of their rulers. Stories spread of pharaohs who had been farmers in previous lives, of gods who favored the humble over the mighty, of ancient kings who had lost their thrones because they forgot the wisdom of the soil. These weren't merely folktales told around evening fires. They were carefully crafted narratives designed to delegitimize the entire ideological foundation of pharaonic rule. The farmers created their own calendar of celebration that deliberately competed with official religious festivals. While the state celebrated the pharaoh's divine birth, farming communities marked the first sprouting of grain seedlings with elaborate rituals that honored the earth itself rather than its supposed divine ruler. These counter-celebrations served multiple purposes. They reinforced community bonds, preserved pre-dynastic religious traditions, and provided cover for resistance meetings under the guise of religious observance. Women played a particularly crucial role in these networks, their movements between villages to attend births, weddings, and funerals, providing perfect cover for the transmission of information and resources. The elderly midwife traveling to assist with a difficult delivery might carry hidden messages about troop movements or tax collection schedules. The young bride moving to her husband's village brought not only dowry goods but intelligence about administrative changes in her home district. Through these seemingly innocent social connections, the resistance networks maintained communication across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. The networks also developed sophisticated early warning systems for detecting informants and state agents. Farming communities had always been suspicious of strangers, but the resistance elevated this natural caution into an art form. New arrivals to villages faced subtle tests of their knowledge and loyalties, probing questions disguised as casual conversation that could reveal whether someone possessed the insider knowledge of a genuine farmer or the superficial understanding of an urban spy. Those who failed these tests found themselves excluded from community activities and cut off from the flow of information. Perhaps most remarkably, these resistance networks maintained their cohesion across multiple generations through the development of what we might recognize today as oral constitutions. Complex codes of conduct, procedures for decision-making, and methods for resolving disputes were embedded in traditional songs, proverbs, and ritual practices that passed from parent to child. A seemingly innocent work song might contain detailed instructions for identifying trustworthy allies. A traditional blessing recited at harvest time could encode the procedures for safely distributing surplus grain to needy families. The networks adapted constantly to changing circumstances, developing new techniques as the state apparatus evolved. When the administration began using literacy tests to identify potential scribes for recruitment, farming communities responded by deliberately hiding the reading abilities of their children. When new taxation methods were introduced, the networks quickly developed countermeasures. When foreign invasions disrupted traditional power structures, the resistance networks proved far more resilient than the official bureaucracy, maintaining order and providing services when state authority collapsed entirely. These underground systems of mutual aid and covert resistance represented something unprecedented in human history. A sustained, multi-generational campaign of organized passive resistance by an oppressed population against a totalitarian state. The farmers of ancient Egypt, dismissed by their contemporaries as ignorant laborers and forgotten by most historians, had actually created one of the world's first sophisticated networks of civil disobedience. Their methods would be recognizable to resistance fighters in Nazi-occupied Europe, to civil rights organizers in the American South, to dissidents in Soviet Russia. The ultimate testament to the effectiveness of these networks lies not in any dramatic moment of open rebellion, but in their very invisibility to official record keepers. For over 3 millennia, as dynasties rose and fell, as foreign armies conquered and native rulers reclaimed power, As administrative systems were reformed and religious practices evolved, the farming communities of Egypt maintained their parallel structures of solidarity and resistance. They preserved their dignity, protected their knowledge, and ensured their survival through the longest-lasting civilization in human history, all while appearing to their rulers as nothing more than obedient servants of divine authority. Their greatest victory was perhaps the most subtle. They convinced their oppressors that oppression was unnecessary, that the farmers were naturally compliant and required only minimal supervision. In reality, they had simply become so skilled at resistance that it appeared as submission, so effective at preserving their autonomy that it looked like dependence. The pharaohs built their monuments believing they ruled over devoted subjects, never realizing that beneath their feet ran networks of defiance as vast and enduring as the Nile itself. Looking at your script so far, and the reference materials provided, here's part 7 of your 12-part script on boring history: the brutal lives of Egyptian farmers. But perhaps the most insidious form of control wasn't the whip or the overseer's fist. It was hunger itself, wielded as a weapon of domination. The Egyptian state perfected what we might call nutritional oppression, a calculated system that kept farmers alive enough to work but weak enough to never rebel. Picture this. You've just harvested enough grain to feed your family for months, maybe even with some left over. But before a single kernel reaches your children's mouths, the tax collectors arrive. They take their share first. Always first. The temples demand their tribute to the gods. The pharaoh's granaries must be filled. The army needs provisions. What's left for you? Scraps. This wasn't accidental. Egyptian administrators kept meticulous records, calculating precisely how little a farmer could survive on while still maintaining productivity. Papyrus documents from the Middle Kingdom revealed chilling efficiency in this system. They knew exactly how many calories a laborer needed to dig irrigation ditches, how much protein was required for heavy lifting, how little sleep a human could function on before collapse. The result was a population living in perpetual malnutrition. Skeletal remains from worker villagers show the evidence carved into bone itself. Stunted growth from childhood hunger, spinal compression from carrying impossibly heavy loads on weakened frames, dental decay from subsisting on coarse bread that wore teeth down to nubs. These weren't the bodies of free people. They were the engineered products of systematic starvation. Consider the daily reality. Your typical farmer would wake before dawn, already weak from the previous day's labor and insufficient food. Breakfast, if it existed, might be a handful of onions and a piece of bread so coarse it could chip teeth. Then 12 hours under the blazing sun, hauling water, tending crops, building monuments to gods who seemed to despise you. By evening, you'd return to find your children hollow-eyed with hunger, your wife's milk dried up from her own malnutrition. The psychological warfare was just as devastating. Feast days existed, but only to remind farmers what they couldn't have. During religious festivals, the wealthy would feast on roasted duck, honeyed cakes, wine, and beer. The aroma would drift through the workers' quarters like torture. Farmers would watch through gaps in walls as nobles gorged themselves on delicacies that represented months of a labourer's wages. Even their children weren't spared this calculated cruelty. Young ones were put to work as soon as they could walk, not just to increase productivity, but to break their spirits early. A 6-year-old carrying water jars, stumbling under the weight, learning that their purpose was to serve. There was no childhood in the fields of Egypt, only preparation for a lifetime of submission. The truly diabolical part was how this system made collaboration seem rational. When you're starving, when your children are starving, you'll inform on your neighbor's hidden grain stores for an extra ration. You'll work extra hours for a promise of meat. You'll denounce resistance movements to earn favor with overseers. Hunger turned farmers against each other, making organized rebellion nearly impossible. But here's what the pharaohs never understood. Desperation breeds creativity. While the state controlled food distribution, farmers developed shadow networks that the authorities never fully grasped. They learned to hide grain in false-bottom storage jars, disguised as religious offerings. They perfected the art of looking malnourished, while secretly maintaining just enough strength for resistance activities. Women played a crucial role in these survival networks. While men worked the fields under constant supervision, women moved more freely between households. They became the communication network, passing information about hidden food stores, warning of upcoming raids, coordinating the careful redistribution of resources that kept families alive. A seemingly innocent conversation about bread recipes might actually be coded instructions for a food drop. Children too became unwitting participants in this underground economy. Small enough to slip through cracks, quick enough to evade capture, they carried messages and small amounts of food between households. The Egyptian state never imagined that the very children they worked to exhaustion could become the arteries of a resistance network. The farmers even weaponized religious festivals. During celebrations honoring Renenutet, the goddess of harvest, seemingly traditional offerings became opportunities to redistribute hidden stores. Families would donate food to temples, knowing it would be quietly redistributed to the most desperate. The very religious ceremonies designed to reinforce state control became cover for community mutual aid. Perhaps most remarkably, they turned the state's own record-keeping against itself. Farmers learned to read the basic hieroglyphs used in agricultural documentation. When tax collectors came with their papyrus scrolls, farmers could sometimes spot discrepancies, errors that could be exploited, a mismarked field boundary here, a miscounted harvest there. These tiny acts of bureaucratic resistance added up to meaningful relief for families on the edge of starvation. The Egyptian state responded to these networks with increasing paranoia and violence. Surprise raids on homes became common, searching for hidden grain. Families were punished collectively for individual acts of resistance. The penalty for hoarding food could be brutal public beatings or forced labor in the most dangerous projects. Yet the networks persisted, evolved, adapted. They had to. Because the alternative wasn't just submission, it was death. These farmers understood something their oppressors never grasped, that a people united by shared suffering and common purpose could find ways to survive even the most sophisticated systems of control. What emerges from this brutal history isn't just a story of oppression, but of the incredible human capacity to maintain dignity and community even under the most dehumanizing conditions. These farmers, whose names we'll never know, whose stories were never recorded in official histories, created something remarkable. They built a parallel civilization within the empire, one based on mutual aid rather than exploitation, on shared survival rather than individual accumulation. And this shadow civilization, this network of resistance and care, would prove more enduring than all the pharaohs' monuments. Long after the Great Pyramids became tourist attractions and the mighty Egyptian empire crumbled into desert sand, the principles these farmers lived by, solidarity, resourcefulness, the refusal to abandon hope, would resurface in every subsequent struggle for human dignity. Their legacy lives on in every community that chooses cooperation over competition, in every movement that prioritizes human need over profit, in every act of quiet resistance against systems that treat people as expendable resources. The farmers of ancient Egypt may have been forgotten by official history, but their spirit echoes through every generation that refuses to accept that suffering is inevitable and exploitation is natural. This section maintains the engaging conversational tone while delving deeper into the systematic nature of oppression and the remarkable resilience of the farmers' resistance networks. It continues building toward the larger themes of human dignity and the enduring power of collective action that seem to be central to your series. Based on the script summary and reference materials, here's Part 8, continuing the exploration of Egyptian farmers' resistance networks and their hidden forms of defiance. The resistance networks that flourished beneath the watchful eyes of Egyptian overseers represented far more than simple survival strategies. They embodied a sophisticated underground economy of dignity that operated parallel to the official channels of power. While scribes meticulously recorded grain quotas and tax collections on papyrus scrolls, they remained oblivious to the intricate web of mutual aid that sustained entire communities through the harshest seasons. These networks functioned through what we might call whispered currencies. Information became as valuable as bread. A farmer who discovered which fields the tax collectors would inspect first could warn his neighbors in time for them to hide their better grain. Knowledge of when the Nile would flood, passed down through generations of careful observation, allowed communities to coordinate their planting and harvesting in ways that maximize their hidden reserves while still meeting official demands. The sophistication of these systems rivaled anything devised by the pharaohs' administrators. Consider the practice of shadow harvesting. During the official harvest, when every stalk was supposedly counted and recorded, farmers developed techniques for concealing portions of their crop. They would harvest sections of their fields under cover of darkness, storing grain in underground chambers lined with pottery shards to keep out moisture and pests. These hidden granaries, scattered across the landscape and known only to trusted community members, formed a secret insurance system against famine and excessive taxation. Women played crucial roles in these resistance networks, often serving as the primary organizers of food distribution systems. While men worked the fields under direct supervision, women moved more freely between households, carrying not just gossip and news, but coordinating the movement of resources. They developed elaborate codes embedded in everyday conversation. A comment about the quality of someone's bread might actually be intelligence about tax collector movements. Discussions of weaving patterns could conceal information about which families needed assistance. The networks also encompassed what we might call technological resistance. Farmers deliberately cultivated multiple varieties of the same crop, some visible to officials and others hidden in remote corners of their plots. They maintained secret seed banks, preserving strains of wheat and barley that were more resistant to drought or disease, but produced smaller visible yields. This agricultural biodiversity became a form of insurance, ensuring that communities could survive even when official crops failed. Perhaps most remarkably, these resistance networks developed their own systems of justice and conflict resolution. Since farmers could not rely on official courts, which heavily favored the wealthy and powerful, they created alternative mechanisms for settling disputes and maintaining order. Village elders, who were trusted by the community rather than appointed by authorities, mediated conflicts over water rights, boundary disputes, and resource allocation. These informal courts operated according to principles of collective welfare rather than strict legal precedent. The spiritual dimensions of resistance ran even deeper than material cooperation. While farmers participated in official religious ceremonies honoring the pharaoh and state gods, they simultaneously maintained underground spiritual practices that emphasized human dignity and mutual obligation. These beliefs, passed down through oral tradition rather than written texts, provided ideological foundations for their resistance networks. They told stories of gods who favored the poor, of divine justice that would ultimately triumph over earthly oppression, and of the sacred nature of the land that belonged to all people rather than just the elite. Communication within these networks relied on sophisticated methods that exploited the very rhythms of agricultural life that the state sought to control. Market days became opportunities for exchanging information across wide geographic areas. Religious festivals, while officially celebrating state power, provided cover for coordinating resistance activities. Even funeral processions served as vehicles for spreading news and maintaining network connections, as mourners from different villages gathered to pay their respects. The networks also developed early warning systems that allowed communities to prepare for increased state pressure. Farmers who worked closer to administrative centers would observe the movements of tax collectors, military units, and other officials, then relay this information through the network. A particular pattern of smoke from cooking fires, the timing of certain songs during work, or the arrangement of tools in fields could all carry coded messages about impending raids or inspections. Over time, these resistance networks began to influence the behavior of some lower-level officials. Local overseers, many of whom came from farming families themselves, sometimes found their loyalties divided between their official duties and their community connections. Some became double agents of sorts, providing early warnings about enforcement actions while maintaining their positions within the official hierarchy. This created additional layers of protection for the resistance networks while also demonstrating their growing influence. The economic impact of these hidden systems was substantial. By maintaining parallel resource flows and supporting struggling families, the networks prevented the kind of widespread social collapse that might have threatened the stability of the entire agricultural system. Ironically, the state benefited from these illegal activities, even as it sought to suppress them. The networks ensured that farming communities remained productive enough to meet tax obligations, while preventing the desperation that might have led to open rebellion. Educational functions also emerged within these networks. Knowledge about farming techniques, weather patterns, and resource management was preserved and transmitted through informal teaching systems that operated alongside, and sometimes in opposition to, official training programs. Young farmers learned not just how to grow crops, but how to navigate the complex social and political landscape of rural Egypt. They discovered which officials could be trusted, how to recognize signs of impending policy changes, and most importantly, how to maintain their dignity and autonomy within an oppressive system. The resistance networks also fostered cultural preservation and innovation. While the state promoted standardized practices and beliefs, the underground communities maintained diverse traditions, languages, and customs. They created new forms of art, music, and storytelling that reflected their experiences of resistance and survival. These cultural expressions, shared within trusted circles, helped maintain group identity and solidarity across generations. Perhaps most significantly, these networks demonstrated the fundamental limitations of authoritarian control. Despite possessing overwhelming military power, vast bureaucratic resources, and sophisticated surveillance systems, the Egyptian state could never completely penetrate or control the social fabric of rural communities. The farmers' resistance networks represented spaces of genuine autonomy within an otherwise totalitarian system, proving that human dignity and mutual aid could flourish even under the most oppressive conditions. The legacy of these ancient resistance networks extends far beyond their immediate historical context. They established patterns of grassroots organization and mutual support that would be replicated in resistance movements throughout history. The techniques they developed for communication, resource sharing, and collective action provided blueprints for later struggles against oppression. Most importantly, they demonstrated that ordinary people, working together with creativity and determination, could maintain their humanity and agency even when confronted by seemingly insurmountable power. These hidden networks remind us that history is never simply the story of those who ruled, but equally the story of those who resisted, survived, and preserved alternative visions of human possibility in the face of systematic brutality. Based on your script summary and the reference materials, here's part 9 of your 12-part script about the brutal lives of Egyptian farmers. As these underground networks of resistance took root across the Nile Valley, they began to reshape the very fabric of Egyptian society in ways that pharaonic authorities could never fully comprehend. The resistance wasn't merely about surviving another harvest or avoiding the tax collector's whip. It was about preserving something far more precious than grain or gold: the fundamental dignity of human existence. Consider the story of Kenti, a middle-aged farmer whose family had worked the same plot of land for 7 generations. Like countless others, Kenti had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of pharaonic bureaucracy through carefully cultivated relationships within the resistance network. When word spread through the village's secret communication channels that the regional overseer planned to seize his land for a new temple complex, Kenti didn't simply accept his fate as divine will. Instead, he activated a web of connections that stretched from his own mud-brick home to the scribal offices in Memphis. A cousin who worked in the granaries provided intelligence about the overseer's own illegal stockpiling of grain. A neighbor's son, employed as a servant in the local administrator's household, revealed the official's weakness for expensive imported wine. An elderly woman who sold vegetables in the market had developed relationships with several mid-level bureaucrats who owed her favors. Within weeks, this network had orchestrated a subtle but devastating campaign. Anonymous tips reached the right ears about the overseer's corruption. Mysterious delays plagued his favorite wine shipments. Critical documents supporting his land seizure somehow developed water damage in the archives. Key witnesses to his legal claims fell inexplicably ill on crucial testimony days. When the dust settled, the overseer found himself transferred to a remote posting in Nubia, and Kenti's land remained secure. This wasn't an isolated incident, but rather one thread in an intricate tapestry of resistance that spanned the entire kingdom. Egyptian farmers had developed what we might recognize today as sophisticated intelligence networks, complete with coded language, secure communication channels, and elaborate systems of mutual protection. They understood that information was power, and they had learned to weaponize their collective knowledge against the very system that sought to crush them. The resistance networks operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most basic level, they provided immediate survival assistance. When drought struck a particular region, surplus grain would mysteriously appear from hidden caches maintained by neighboring communities. When tax collectors demanded impossible quotas, false documentation would circulate showing reduced harvests. When forced labor conscription swept through villages, essential workers would temporarily vanish into elaborate hiding systems before reappearing once the danger passed. But the networks also functioned as sophisticated economic institutions. Farmers developed parallel trading systems that bypassed official markets and their crushing taxation. They established their own credit arrangements, allowing struggling families to borrow seed grain or tools without falling into the debt slavery that official lending typically entailed. They created insurance systems where communities pooled resources to protect individual families against catastrophic losses. Perhaps most remarkably, these networks served as alternative governance structures. When official justice proved corrupt or absent, village councils operating within the resistance framework would arbitrate disputes, enforce agreements, and maintain social order. They developed their own legal codes based on practical fairness rather than pharaonic decree. They established protocols for resource allocation during crises that prioritized community survival over individual profit. The psychological impact of these networks cannot be overstated. For farmers who spent their days bowing before overseers and surrendering the fruits of their labor to distant palaces, the knowledge that they possessed hidden power provided crucial psychological sustenance. They might appear powerless during daylight hours, but in the shadows, they were architects of their own destiny. The networks also preserved and transmitted knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. Agricultural techniques that improved yields were shared secretly between communities. Medicinal practices that could treat diseases were passed down through underground channels. Stories, songs, and traditions that celebrated farmer resilience rather than pharaonic glory were kept alive in clandestine gatherings. Even more subversively, the networks maintained alternative historical narratives. While official scribes recorded the glorious achievements of god-kings, farmers preserved memories of droughts survived, famines endured, and communities rebuilt after devastating floods. These counter-histories reminded each generation that ordinary people, not divine rulers, were the true architects of Egyptian civilization. The sophistication of these resistance networks extended to their operational security. Farmers developed elaborate codes disguised as ordinary conversation. A discussion about grain varieties might actually be coordinating a tax resistance effort. Complaints about sick livestock could be warnings about approaching officials. Religious festivals provided cover for network meetings, with genuine worship seamlessly blending with strategic planning. The networks also proved remarkably adaptable to changing circumstances. When new pharaohs brought different administrative systems, the resistance evolved accordingly. When foreign invasions disrupted traditional power structures, the networks filled the resulting vacuum. When technological changes altered agricultural practices, the resistance incorporated these innovations into their survival strategies. Perhaps most importantly, these networks created a sense of agency that transcended the immediate circumstances of any individual farmer's life. Members understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that connected them to past generations of resistance and future generations who would inherit their struggle. This sense of historical continuity provided meaning that no amount of oppression could entirely destroy. The networks also fostered innovation born of necessity. Farmers developed new agricultural techniques that could be implemented secretly to increase yields without attracting official attention. They created improved storage methods that could hide surplus grain from tax collectors. They invented communication systems that could rapidly spread warnings across vast distances without detection. These innovations weren't merely practical. They represented acts of creative defiance against a system designed to reduce farmers to interchangeable units of production. Every new technique developed within the resistance networks was simultaneously a tool for survival and a declaration of human ingenuity that no pharaoh could claim to own. The economic impact of these networks gradually became substantial enough to influence the broader Egyptian economy. When resistance networks coordinated to withhold labor or redirect resources, the effects rippled through the entire kingdom. Pyramid construction projects faced mysterious delays when key workers proved unavailable. Military campaigns struggled with supply shortages when farmers coordinated to limit surplus production. Palace feasts grew noticeably less lavish when agricultural communities diverted their finest products to internal networks rather than official markets. Over time, even pharaonic administrators began to recognize that some level of farmer autonomy was necessary for the system to function. Rather than crushing every trace of resistance, smart officials learned to tolerate and even indirectly negotiate with these networks. This created a complex dynamic where official oppression and underground resistance existed in a kind of equilibrium, each side understanding the limits of what the other would accept. The networks also created opportunities for social mobility that the official system denied. Farmers who demonstrated exceptional skill in organizing resistance activities might find themselves elevated to leadership positions within their communities. Intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and network coordination became pathways to influence and respect that existed entirely outside the pharaonic hierarchy. Women played particularly crucial roles in these networks, often serving as the primary coordinators of information flow between households. The official system largely ignored women's activities, making them ideal for carrying messages, hiding resources, and maintaining the social connections that held communities together. Many of the most effective resistance leaders were women whose official invisibility became their greatest asset. Children, too, were integrated into the networks from an early age, learning the skills of survival and resistance alongside traditional farming techniques. They grew up understanding that surface compliance and hidden defiance weren't contradictory, but complementary strategies for maintaining human dignity in an oppressive system. The religious dimensions of these networks added another layer of complexity. While farmers participated in official religious ceremonies as required, they also maintained spiritual practices that celebrated their own relationship with the land and the gods. These alternative religious traditions emphasize the sacred nature of agricultural work and the divine justice that would ultimately vindicate the oppressed. These spiritual beliefs provided both comfort and justification for resistance activities. Farmers understood themselves to be serving divine will when they protected their communities, preserved their traditions, and resisted unjust demands. This religious framework transformed practical resistance into sacred duty, creating a moral foundation that sustained the networks through generations of struggle. The long-term impact of these resistance networks extended far beyond the immediate relief they provided to individual farmers. They created institutional knowledge about how oppressed communities could organize for mutual support and collective action. They demonstrated that even the most powerful authoritarian systems contained vulnerabilities that organized resistance could exploit. They proved that ordinary people possessed the intelligence, creativity, and determination necessary to challenge seemingly invincible hierarchies. As we approach the end of our exploration of Egyptian farmer resistance, it becomes clear that these networks represented far more than mere survival strategies. They were laboratories of human potential, spaces where ordinary people could experiment with alternative forms of social organization, economic cooperation, and political decision-making. They were universities where each generation learned lessons about power, justice, and human dignity that no pharaonic school would ever teach. The farmers who built and maintained these networks understood something that their oppressors never grasped: that human beings possess an irreducible core of dignity and agency that no amount of force can entirely destroy. Their resistance wasn't simply about preserving their physical lives, but about maintaining their humanity in a system designed to reduce them to mere instruments of production. In their quiet defiance, their hidden cooperation, and their persistent hope for something better, these farmers embodied the enduring truth that ordinary people, working together, possess the power to shape their own destiny, regardless of the obstacles arrayed against them. Their legacy reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to resist, to create, and to hope. Based on the reference materials you've provided, here's part 10 of the 12-part script on Boring History: The Brutal Lives of Egyptian Farmers. As we've seen, the Egyptian farming class had developed remarkable networks of resistance that operated like arteries beneath the visible body of the state. These underground systems of mutual aid, secret knowledge, and covert defiance had sustained them for generations. But even these carefully crafted survival mechanisms could not shield them from one of the most devastating forces that periodically swept across the Nile Valley: the dreaded years of famine. When the annual flood failed to arrive, or came too weak, or raged too violently, the consequences rippled through Egyptian society with the force of a divine curse. The farmers, who lived closest to the knife's edge of survival, felt these disasters first and most brutally. Yet it was precisely during these times of crisis that their hidden networks proved most vital and their quiet defiance most necessary. Picture the scene when the Nile's waters receded in late summer, revealing not the rich dark silt that farmers prayed for, but cracked, barren earth stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The officials would still demand their quotas, the temples would still require their offerings, the pharaoh's granaries would still need filling, but the land, that eternal provider, had turned treacherous. In a normal year, an Egyptian farming family might expect to keep perhaps 1/5 of what they grew. The rest disappeared into the vast machinery of the state: taxes, tribute, forced labor obligations, temple offerings, and the countless other demands that rained down upon them like locusts. But when famine struck, even that meager portion vanished. Families who had worked the same plots for generations suddenly found themselves staring at empty storage jars and calculating how many days their children might survive on what remained. The official records, carved in stone and written on papyrus, tell us little about these human tragedies. They speak in cold numbers: reduced harvests, lowered tax assessments, administrative adjustments. But between these lines lies an ocean of suffering that the scribes never bothered to record. Mothers grinding lotus seeds and papyrus roots into flour. Fathers trading precious family heirlooms for handfuls of grain. Children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes, their growth permanently stunted by malnutrition. Yet even in these darkest hours, the farmers' underground networks revealed their true purpose. When the state's protection proved worthless, when the pharaoh's divine power offered no relief from empty stomachs, it was these hidden bonds of solidarity that kept communities alive. Families who had managed to hide away emergency stores would quietly share with their neighbors. Villages would pool their remaining resources, creating communal kitchens where a single pot of thin gruel might feed dozens of people. The farmers had learned, through bitter experience, that survival depended not on the mercy of their rulers, but on their ability to care for one another. They developed elaborate systems for identifying families in desperate need, using coded messages and secret signals that bypassed official channels entirely. A particular arrangement of stones near a doorway might indicate that children inside were starving. A specific way of hanging laundry could signal that a family had surplus to share. These networks operated with remarkable efficiency precisely because they had been forced to develop in secret. Unlike the cumbersome bureaucracy of the state, which moved slowly and demanded endless documentation, the farmers' mutual aid systems could respond within hours. Word would spread through the hidden channels. A family in the next village had found a cache of wild plants that could be ground into edible paste. A fisherman had caught more than his quota and was willing to trade. A woman knew where reeds grew that could be woven into baskets to trade for food. But perhaps most remarkably, these famine networks served as schools for resistance. When people are reduced to the most basic struggle for survival, the illusions that normally sustain oppressive systems begin to crumble. Farmers who had spent their lives accepting the divine right of pharaohs suddenly found themselves asking uncomfortable questions. If the king was truly a god, why did he not stop the famine? If the priests could speak to the gods, why did their temples remain full while children starved? During these crisis periods, the farmers' hidden networks became conduits, not just for food and aid, but for dangerous ideas. Stories would circulate about officials who lived in luxury while their subjects died. Plans would form for collective action, entire villages refusing to hand over their seed grain, even if it meant facing punishment. Workers abandoning construction projects to search for food, despite the threat of violence from overseers. The state, of course, was not blind to these developments. During famines, the authorities would often respond with increased surveillance and harsher punishments, trying to maintain control over a population pushed to the breaking point. But they faced an impossible task. How do you intimidate people who are already dying? How do you threaten starvation against those who have nothing left to lose? Some of the most powerful acts of resistance recorded in Egyptian history occurred during these famine years. Workers would simply walk away from royal projects, heading home to tend to their dying families. entire communities would abandon their villages, moving en masse to search for better conditions elsewhere. These weren't organized rebellions in the traditional sense, but something perhaps more threatening: the quiet collapse of the social contract that held the system together. The farmers learned to read the signs of impending disaster with an expertise that rivaled any court astronomer. They knew which birds disappeared before a poor flood, which plants withered when the rains would fail, which wind patterns brought hope, and which brought despair. This knowledge, passed down through generations and refined by bitter experience, gave them precious months to prepare for the worst. They developed techniques for preserving food that could stretch meager supplies through the longest famines. They knew which weeds and wild plants could substitute for grain, which tree barks could be ground into flour, which insects and small animals could provide protein when livestock died. They created elaborate systems for rationing water, for maintaining seed grain through the darkest times, for keeping hope alive when death seemed inevitable. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to maintain their humanity in the face of dehumanizing circumstances. The networks that sustained them through famines weren't just about physical survival. They were about preserving dignity, community, and hope. Families would share their last piece of bread, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Communities would care for orphan children, not because the state demanded it, but because they refused to let the bonds that held them together be broken by hunger. These acts of solidarity, repeated thousands of times across thousands of villages over thousands of years, represented a form of resistance that no pharaoh could crush. They demonstrated that even in the most extreme circumstances, people could choose compassion over cruelty, community over competition, love over fear. They proved that the human spirit, however battered and bruised, could not be permanently broken. When the good years returned, as they eventually did, these famine networks didn't simply disappear. They evolved, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining their essential purpose. The bonds forged in crisis became the foundation for ongoing resistance. The skills learned in desperation became tools for daily survival. The trust built through shared suffering became the bedrock of an alternative society that existed in the shadows of official power. The farmers understood something that their rulers never quite grasped: that true security came not from the accumulation of wealth or the exercise of power, but from the knowledge that others would stand with you when everything else failed. They had created, through necessity and choice, a system of mutual aid that was more reliable than any government, more enduring than any dynasty, more powerful than any army. This was their greatest act of defiance, the refusal to let the brutal logic of their world turn them into brutes themselves. In a society built on exploitation and maintained through violence, they had managed to preserve islands of humanity. In a system designed to isolate and weaken them, they had found ways to connect and strengthen each other. In a world that treated them as expendable, they had created communities where every life mattered. The echoes of these ancient networks can still be felt today in every community that comes together during disasters, in every act of mutual aid that bypasses official channels, in every moment when ordinary people choose solidarity over self-interest. The Egyptian farmers, who developed these systems of resistance and survival, left behind more than stone monuments or golden treasures. They left behind a legacy of human resilience that continues to inspire and sustain us, proving that even the most oppressive systems cannot extinguish the fundamental human capacity for hope, resistance, and love. Here's part 11 of your script, focusing on the brutal lives of Egyptian farmers. But these resistance networks, no matter how sophisticated, could not shield Egyptian farmers from the daily brutality that defined their existence. Every sunrise brought fresh torment to those who worked the land along the Nile. The Egyptian agricultural system operated like a massive grinding wheel. crushing human lives to produce wealth for the pharaoh and his elite circle. Consider the life of Katie, a typical farmer during the Middle Kingdom period. His day began before dawn, when the air still carried a hint of coolness from the desert night. By the time the sun crested the horizon, he was already knee-deep in the muddy fields, his bare feet sinking into the irrigation channels that crisscrossed his assigned plot. The water was often contaminated with human and animal waste, breeding grounds for parasites that would burrow into his skin and cause debilitating infections. Katie's tools were primitive even by ancient standards. His wooden plough, pulled by emaciated oxen, barely scratched the surface of the hardened earth. The iron blade, if he was fortunate enough to have one, was dull and chipped from constant use. More often, he worked with implements made of fire-hardened wood and stone, tools that would have been familiar to farmers from 1,000 years earlier. The Egyptian farming calendar was merciless in its demands. During the flood season, when the Nile overflowed its banks, farmers like Katie were pressed into service on massive construction projects. They hauled limestone blocks for pyramids, dug canals for irrigation systems, and built granaries to store the grain they would never taste. The work was backbreaking, performed under the scorching sun with minimal food and water. Overseers carried whips and used them liberally on anyone who showed signs of fatigue or rebellion. When the floods receded, the real agricultural work began. The fertile black soil, enriched by Nilotic silt, had to be prepared quickly before it dried into concrete-hard clay. Farmers worked in teams, breaking up the earth with hoes and mattocks, while the moisture remained. This was perhaps the most physically demanding period of the farming year. Men collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies simply unable to cope with the relentless pace demanded by the overseer's schedule. The planting season brought its own horrors. Seeds were precious, strictly rationed by government officials, who counted every grain of barley and wheat. Farmers who spilled seed or failed to achieve optimal planting density faced severe punishment. The work required constant bending and squatting, motions that left permanent damage to spines and joints. Many farmers developed a characteristic hunched posture from decades of this labor, their bodies literally shaped by their oppression. But it was during harvest time that the true brutality of the Egyptian agricultural system revealed itself. The grain belonged entirely to the pharaoh's administration. Farmers who had sweated and bled to grow the crops were forbidden from consuming any significant portion of their harvest. Tax collectors, accompanied by soldiers, arrived at each field with measuring baskets and detailed records. They took not just the official tax rate, which was already crushing, but often demanded additional voluntary contributions for various festivals, military campaigns, or construction projects. The measuring process itself was rigged against the farmers. Official baskets were often larger than the standard size, meaning farmers had to provide more grain than technically required. Collectors frequently claimed that grain was of poor quality and demanded additional amounts to meet their quotas. Those who protested faced immediate violence. Archaeological evidence from worker villages shows numerous skeletons, with healed fractures consistent with beatings administered by clubs and staffs. Egyptian farmers lived in constant fear of famine, despite working in one of the world's most fertile regions. When Nile floods were insufficient, crop yields dropped dramatically. But the tax burden remained unchanged. Farmers were still expected to deliver their full quotas to government granaries, even if it meant their families would starve. The state showed no mercy during these crisis periods. Officials reasoned that maintaining the pharaoh's divine status and the kingdom's military strength took precedence over the survival of individual farming families. The housing provided to agricultural workers was deliberately designed to be temporary and uncomfortable. Most farmers lived in mud brick hovels that measured no more than 10 feet square. These structures housed entire families, often including elderly relatives and young children. There was no privacy, no protection from the elements, and no sanitation. Diseases spread rapidly through these cramped quarters. Infant mortality rates in farming communities often exceeded 50%. The diet of Egyptian farmers was carefully calculated to provide just enough nutrition to maintain productivity, while preventing any accumulation of strength that might lead to rebellion. The basic ration consisted of bread made from coarse barley, supplemented with onions, garlic, and occasionally dried fish. This diet was severely deficient in protein and essential vitamins. Many farmers developed night blindness from vitamin A deficiency, joint problems from lack of calcium, and chronic fatigue from iron deficiency anemia. Water, despite the proximity of the Nile, was often contaminated and dangerous to drink. Farmers were required to use irrigation channels for drinking water, the same channels that carried agricultural runoff, human waste, and decomposing organic matter. Waterborne diseases were endemic. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasitic worms, affected virtually every farmer along the Nile. The disease caused chronic pain, organ damage, and eventually death. Egyptian medical papyri describe the symptoms in detail, but offer no effective treatments. The social isolation of farmers was as deliberate as their physical oppression. They were forbidden from traveling without official permits, preventing them from organizing across different agricultural districts. Families were frequently separated when adult men were conscripted for construction projects or military service. Children were often taken from their parents at young ages to serve in temples or noble households. These separations served the dual purpose of providing cheap labor for elite institutions while breaking down family bonds that might serve as foundations for resistance. Perhaps most tragically, the Egyptian agricultural system destroyed farmers' connection to the land they worked. In many ancient societies, farmers developed deep spiritual and emotional relationships with their fields, viewing agriculture as a sacred partnership between human effort and natural forces. But Egyptian farmers were explicitly told that they were temporary caretakers of the pharaoh's property. They had no ownership rights, no guarantee that they would work the same fields from year to year, and no hope that their children would inherit anything beyond a life of agricultural servitude. The psychological toll of this system was devastating. Egyptian farmers lived without hope of improvement, without the possibility of accumulating property or wealth, and without any meaningful control over their daily lives. They existed in a state of perpetual uncertainty, never knowing whether the next day would bring a beating from an overseer, conscription for a military campaign, or separation from their families. This chronic stress manifested in various physical and mental health problems that are visible in the archaeological record. Religious practices among Egyptian farmers reflected their desperate circumstances. While official state religion focused on the pharaoh's divine nature and the glory of the afterlife for the elite, farmers developed their own spiritual traditions centered on survival and protection. They created small shrines to protective deities, performed rituals designed to ward off disease and famine, and developed elaborate funeral practices that promised a better existence after death. These religious activities were often conducted in secret, as the state viewed unauthorized spiritual practices as potential threats to social order. The clothing and personal possessions of Egyptian farmers tell a story of systematic deprivation. Most wore simple linen garments that were mended repeatedly until they fell apart completely. Shoes were a luxury that few could afford, leaving farmers to work barefoot in fields filled with sharp stubble, thorns, and contaminated water. Personal ornaments were virtually non-existent. Even basic tools like knives or containers were often shared among multiple families, as individual ownership of such items was beyond most farmers' means. Education was deliberately withheld from agricultural workers. The Egyptian elite understood that literacy and numerical skills might enable farmers to keep accurate records of their production and taxation. potentially exposing the systematic theft that characterized the agricultural system. Farmers were forbidden from learning to read hieroglyphic or hieratic scripts. Their children were not allowed to attend schools, ensuring that each generation remained dependent on government officials for all record-keeping and administrative functions. The seasonal cycle of Egyptian agriculture created different forms of suffering throughout the year. During the flood season, when fields were underwater, farmers faced unemployment and near starvation. The government provided minimal rations during this period, just enough to keep workers alive until the next planting season. Many farmers used this time to make mud bricks or engage in other construction activities, but the pay was inadequate to support their families. The flood season was also when many farmers died from diseases, their weakened bodies unable to resist infections during the period of nutritional deprivation. Medical care for farmers was virtually non-existent. While Egyptian civilization produced sophisticated medical knowledge, as evidenced by surviving medical papyri, this expertise was reserved for the elite. Farmers suffering from injuries or illnesses had to rely on folk remedies and the occasional intervention of local wise women. Most medical problems were left untreated, leading to chronic pain, disability, and premature death. The average life expectancy for Egyptian farmers was probably around 30 years, compared to 45 or 50 years for members of the elite classes. The Egyptian state's control over farmers extended even to their deaths. When farmers died, their bodies often became property of the state, used for mummification experiments or anatomical study. Families were rarely allowed to conduct proper burial ceremonies according to their own traditions. Instead, dead farmers were typically buried in mass graves or simple pit burials, without the elaborate preparations that were considered essential for a successful journey to the afterlife. Yet even in the face of such systematic brutality, Egyptian farmers found ways to preserve their humanity and dignity. They developed complex oral traditions that passed down agricultural knowledge, historical memories, and cultural values from generation to generation. They created informal systems of mutual aid that helped families survive during periods of particular hardship. And they maintained their resistance networks, constantly adapting their methods to evade state surveillance and repression. These farmers were the foundation upon which one of history's greatest civilizations was built. Their suffering and sacrifice made possible the pyramids, the temples, the art and the literature that we admire today. But their individual stories, their daily struggles, and their remarkable resilience in the face of overwhelming oppression deserve to be remembered as more than just footnotes to the achievements of their oppressors. They were human beings who endured unimaginable hardship while maintaining their essential humanity, and their legacy is one of courage, endurance, and the unbreakable human spirit. Here is part 12 of the 12-part script for Boring History: The Brutal Lives of Egyptian Farmers. As we reach the final chapter of our exploration into the brutal lives of Egyptian farmers, we must acknowledge that their story extends far beyond the immediate suffering we have documented. The legacy of these forgotten masses shaped the very foundations of human civilization in ways that still resonate through our modern world. Their struggles, their innovations born of desperation, and their quiet acts of defiance created ripples that would eventually transform the ancient world and challenge the seemingly eternal power structures that had defined their existence for millennia. The resistance networks we have explored throughout this series were not merely survival mechanisms. They were the seeds of something far more profound. Within the hidden knowledge shared between farmers, the covert preservation of grain stores, and the subtle acts of sabotage against state projects, we can trace the earliest forms of organized opposition to absolute power. These farmers, despite their position at the bottom of the social hierarchy, possessed something that their rulers could never fully control: the understanding that their labor was the foundation upon which the entire empire rested. This realization, passed down through generations of oppressed farmers, would eventually manifest in more organized forms of resistance. The great slave revolts that periodically shook the ancient world drew their inspiration and leadership from the agricultural laborers who had learned, through centuries of hardship, how to organize, how to hide resources, and how to strike at the heart of the system that exploited them. The knowledge of when to plant and when to withhold labor, when to comply and when to resist, became a form of power that no pharaoh could legislate away. The spiritual traditions maintained by Egyptian farmers also evolved into something far more significant than simple religious observance. Their emphasis on the cyclical nature of life, death, and rebirth, informed by their intimate connection to the agricultural cycle, provided a philosophical framework that challenged the divine authority of their rulers. While pharaohs claimed to be gods, farmers knew that even gods were subject to the laws of nature, to seasons of plenty and seasons of want. This understanding fostered a worldview that recognized the temporary nature of all earthly power, including that of their oppressors. The preservation of cultural practices, songs, stories, and folk wisdom among farming communities created an alternative narrative to the official propaganda of the state. These counter-narratives often contained coded criticisms of the ruling class, celebrations of ordinary heroism, and visions of a more just world. The stories told around cooking fires in farmer hovels were fundamentally different from the heroic tales carved into temple walls. They spoke of the dignity of labor, the value of community solidarity, and the ultimate triumph of persistence over power. Perhaps most significantly, the innovations developed by Egyptian farmers out of necessity would eventually spread throughout the ancient world and beyond. The irrigation techniques perfected under conditions of extreme resource scarcity, the crop rotation methods developed to maximize yields from exhausted soil, and the food preservation technologies created to survive artificial famines would become foundational technologies for agricultural societies across the globe. Knowledge that began as desperate survival strategies would eventually feed empires and support civilizations far removed from the Nile Valley. The organizational structures developed within farming communities also provided models for other forms of collective action. The informal networks of mutual aid, the systems for sharing information and resources, and the methods for making collective decisions without alerting state authorities would later inform the development of guilds, religious movements, and eventually political organizations that challenged the absolute power of monarchs and aristocrats. Even the psychological resilience developed by Egyptian farmers became a form of cultural inheritance that influenced subsequent generations. The ability to maintain hope in the face of systematic oppression, to find meaning in small acts of kindness and solidarity, and to preserve human dignity under dehumanizing conditions, became part of the cultural DNA of communities throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. This resilience would prove crucial during later periods of conquest, colonization, and social upheaval. The economic knowledge accumulated by farmers also had far-reaching consequences. Their understanding of the real value of labor, the true cost of agricultural production, and the mechanisms by which wealth was extracted from producers eventually informed more sophisticated critiques of economic exploitation. The farmers, who could calculate exactly how much of their harvest was taken by the state and how little was left for their families, possessed a practical understanding of economic injustice that would later be formalized into economic and political theories. The gender dynamics within farming communities, where women played crucial roles in food production, preservation, and distribution, created alternative models of social organization that contrasted sharply with the male-dominated hierarchies of the state and temple systems. The respect accorded to women's knowledge of agriculture, medicine, and household management within farming communities provided examples of more egalitarian social arrangements that would influence later social movements and religious reforms. The environmental knowledge preserved by farming communities also proved invaluable to later civilizations. Their understanding of sustainable agricultural practices, developed out of necessity when faced with soil depletion and environmental degradation caused by intensive exploitation, provided crucial insights for societies grappling with similar challenges. The traditional ecological knowledge maintained by farmers often proved more reliable than the grand schemes of rulers and their advisors. The impact of Egyptian farming communities extended beyond the ancient world through the migration and displacement that characterized the later periods of Egyptian history. As political upheavals, foreign conquests, and economic disruptions forced farming families to abandon their ancestral lands, they carried their knowledge, traditions, and organizational methods to new regions. These diaspora communities became conduits for the transmission of agricultural techniques, cultural practices, and social innovations across vast distances. The influence of Egyptian farmers can also be traced through the religious movements that emerged from agricultural communities. The emphasis on cyclical time, the sanctity of labor, and the ultimate justice of natural law that characterized farmer spirituality influenced the development of various religious and philosophical traditions. The idea that the last shall be first, that the meek shall inherit the earth, and that true wealth lies in community solidarity, rather than individual accumulation, can be traced back to the worldview developed by oppressed agricultural communities. The artistic and cultural contributions of farming communities, though largely unrecorded in official histories, profoundly influenced the development of popular culture throughout the ancient world. The songs, stories, decorative arts, and festivals created by farmers provided alternative aesthetic traditions that celebrated different values than those promoted by state and temple art. These popular cultural forms often emphasized humor, irony, and subtle subversion rather than the grandeur and intimidation that characterized official culture. The technological innovations developed by farming communities also had unexpected applications beyond agriculture. The engineering solutions devised for irrigation, the materials science developed for tool making, and the organizational methods created for coordinating collective labor provided foundations for developments in construction, manufacturing, and administration that would benefit later civilizations. Perhaps most importantly, the Egyptian farmers demonstrated that human dignity and creativity could survive even under the most oppressive conditions. Their ability to maintain family bonds, preserve cultural traditions, and find moments of joy and beauty in lives of grinding hardship provided a powerful testimony to the resilience of the human spirit. This example would inspire later generations facing their own struggles against oppression and exploitation. The legacy of Egyptian farmers also lies in their demonstration that seemingly powerless people could, through organization and persistence, exert significant influence on the course of history. Their quiet resistance helped to undermine the foundations of absolute power. Their innovations contributed to technological progress, and their cultural creativity enriched human civilization. They proved that history is not made only by the powerful, but by the countless ordinary people who choose to resist, to preserve, and to create, despite the obstacles placed in their path. As we conclude this examination of the brutal lives of Egyptian farmers, we must recognize that their story is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a testament to the enduring human capacity for resistance, innovation, and solidarity in the face of systematic oppression. Their struggles anticipate the challenges faced by agricultural communities throughout history, from medieval serfs to colonial plantation workers to modern migrant laborers. Their strategies for survival and resistance provide lessons that remain relevant for contemporary movements seeking to challenge inequality and exploitation. The Egyptian farmers remind us that beneath the grand narratives of kings and conquests lies another history, one written in the daily struggles of ordinary people to maintain their humanity and dignity under impossible conditions. Their story challenges us to look beyond the monuments and official records to understand the true foundations of human civilization. It reminds us that progress comes not only from the actions of the powerful, but from the accumulated efforts of countless individuals who choose to resist oppression and preserve hope for future generations. In honoring the memory of these forgotten farmers, we acknowledge our debt to all those who have struggled to create a more just world. Their legacy lives on in every act of resistance against exploitation, every effort to preserve cultural traditions under threat, and every attempt to build solidarity across lines of division. The brutal lives of Egyptian farmers were not lived in vain if we learn from their example and continue their work of building a world where human dignity is respected and human potential can flourish. Their story ends not with their deaths, but with our recognition of their contributions to human civilization. In remembering them, we ensure that their struggles were not meaningless and that their hopes for a better world continue to inspire new generations of people committed to justice, equality, and human flourishing. The Egyptian farmers may have been forgotten by the official histories of their time, but their true monument is the ongoing struggle for a more just world that they helped to begin.